Ashok, Child Man, the Selfless Narcissist is your first book.
Yeah.
Right? And most of us know you as a management consultant, and you have been working for the last 4 decades with individuals, with organizations on personal growth, organizational development. And one may have expected your first book to be something on OB and yet when we see your first book, it's called Child Man, the Selfless Narcissist. What is this concept of the Child Man?
Well, as it happens, I was planning a book which would have been more on the lines of what you call OB. It's true that I've primarily worked with corporates, but my primary interest has always been with what I call the human drama. The human drama, whether it takes place inside an individual, inside families, inside work organizations, inside communities, or wherever. So Child Man, to that extent, is, from my point of view, is not so much in the realm of management alone. It's more in the realm of my understanding of the human context and what's happening to the individual human being in the current situation that we are living in. And one of its features, as I understand, is the growing gap between techno-economic advancement and psychosocial maturity. So while technology is advancing, the kind of maturity which is needed to handle that technology and to comprehend the complex network of forces which govern our lives is taking a beating. And this is particularly so because of the sharp decline in almost all emotional psychological infrastructures like family, community and things like that, making the individual much more, in a sense, helpless, vulnerable, anxious. So you have a situation where on one hand the individual today feels extremely powerful and potent, feels that he has many more choices, that there are many things that are available to him. He is free of many of the earlier constraints which the earlier eras in a sense confined him to. But on the other hand, the sense of helplessness, anxiety, alienation from yourself, aloneness is also making him extremely fragile. So it's really this gap. And this gap I've encountered day in and day out with myself, with the people that I work with.
And very interestingly, you have a byline for the book, The Child Man, and you call it the Selfless Narcissist. Now, to most of us, it seems like a contradiction in terms that how can a narcissist be selfless? Would you throw some light on this fact as well?
Well, actually, a narcissist is always selfless because a narcissist is in love with an image.
Mm-hmm.
A narcissist has no concept of self.
Okay.
A narcissist, and oftentimes you see what happens is that many times we tend to put all kinds of self-centricity into the same basket, right? And we tend to regard all kinds of self-centricity as the same.
As under the bracket of selfish, probably.
That's right, yeah. So an egoist and a narcissist are regarded as the same, but there is a very fundamental difference between the two. An egoist is primarily governed by his own self-interest.
Okay.
Right? A narcissist, on the other hand, is governed primarily by a certain emotional investment that he has made into an image of himself. Often at the cost of his own self-interest, he'll pursue it. The reason I've chosen to use that byline is one, because many times whenever I talk of this, people tend to confuse the concept of a child man with related notions like alpha male. We are not talking of alpha male here.
Yeah. In fact, very different from that.
It's very different from
that. Yes.
Right? Because alpha male will never work against his own self-interest, whereas the child mind does.
Or be fragile in the sense that you described just now.
That's right, yeah. And therefore, it's many times to him, his own self-interest is of no consequence.
Because he's so in love with the image that he's created of himself.
The second reason is that whatever sense of self that the child man has is primarily governed by his narcissistic injuries, by his narcissistic wounds.
Okay.
And all the time he's trying to heal those wounds. So he's not governed, let's say, by achievement, by need for achievement. He's governed by rage and vengeance. He needs to avenge. He needs to set certain things correct, which he thinks are wrong. So therefore, in order to make this and to clearly place it in a certain, call it, and differentiate it from many of the other related things, I've chosen the byline of Selfless Narcissist.
And also, what is very interesting about this book compared to other books of this nature is that it's divided into these two parts. And in the first part, you are talking about stories, actually, narratives of these three characters from the Mahabharata, Balram, Duryodhan and Bhim. Now I have two related questions here. One is, you could have, to create a context for the child, and you could have chosen any epic, any other kind of trope. Why did you choose Mahabharata? And secondly, often when we look at these three characters, Bhim is seen as this, enormously powerful, slightly stupid, second brother, lovable buffoon kind of a person who's been like an assistant to all the victories they've won. Duryodhan is seen as the eternal villain, and Balram is hardly heard of. After they move from Mathura, from Vrindavan to Mathura, he almost disappears into the text. So one would look at the three of them very differently. However, in your book, you have seen a single thread that ties these three very different characters. And so, could you talk about why Mahabharata and why these three characters and how you saw this whole thing pan out?
We'll first take the first, respond to the first question. Partly it's coincidental, and I've written that in the preface of the book.
Okay.
That it so happened that we were discussing a few things. I was talking about it with some of my colleagues. And as I was looking at some of these things, in the night I kept thinking of these three people.
Okay.
Right? So somehow, and I thought that they had some relevance to the kind of issues that we were talking about.
Yeah.
So therefore, it seemed logical to pursue that. At one stage I did, though I had conceived the book in that night, I did think for a while that should I go ahead and either create fictional characters or look for characters elsewhere. But then it's so tempting to fall back on the Mahabharata. Plus, of course, my personal evocation was very strong. As far as the second part of your question is, in terms of these three, it does surprise me that the link between these three is not so clearly seen, right? Because all three were mace warriors.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Balram was the teacher of
these two.
These two. They all showed certain kinds of similarities in terms of their temperaments. Clearly there were differences. And in fact, in the second part, the first chapter, which is called The Three Protagonists, looks at both their similarities and their differences. Right? So I'm not saying that they were identical. Right? There were clearly differences in the way they dealt with certain kinds of things. But the commonalities, the common thread, at least from my point of view, from the child man psyche point of view, is very clear. Also in that chapter on the three protagonists, I've talked about how I see, and I'm of course no expert on Mahabharata, but in my understanding, in my appreciation, in a sense, Bhim and Duryodhan were actually extensions of Balrama.
Okay.
Just as Krishna, Arjuna and Karna were extensions of Krishna. Right? And if you look at all the central conflicts of Mahabharata, they are between these two sets of protagonists.
Yes.
Right?
And there's also a relationship between Krishna and Balrama as the heads of those two triangles,
That's right.
which manifest in these
two.